Good evening, and thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's program. My name is Melissa Loriano, and I serve as the Programs Manager for the DC Preservation League. For those of you who may not know DCPL, our organization has been dedicated to preserving and protecting the historic built environment of Washington, DC since 1971. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors whose annual financial support helps underwrite public programs like this one today. And they are Denton's, Douglas Development, Antunovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Bayer Blinder Bell, EHT Traceries, and KCE Structural Engineers. So many thanks to you all for your dedication to historic preservation in Washington, DC. So before the presentation begins, I just want to share a few brief notes about how our program is going to work tonight. So please use the Q&A found at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions. I'm going to collect your questions and verbally ask them of our panelists following the documentary. And for those of you joining us on Facebook Live, DCPL's Director of Development, Kelly Knox, will be monitoring any questions that you all might have and will pass those along to us as well. And if we don't get to everybody's questions, you can always email us at info@dcpreservation.org and we will get back to you as soon as we can. So just some background of how this documentary came about. This spring, the DC Preservation League had the wonderful opportunity to partner with Sajel Schwartz, Shae Corey, and Michael Jacobs, a group of students from American University's Public History graduate program, to create this mini documentary that explores the most endangered places list developed by DCPL over the last 25 years. So these students conducted research on the 9 sites that will be highlighted in this documentary. And part of this research also involved interviewing community leaders and advocates who participated in the campaigns to save these places. So based on their research and those interviews, Sajel, Shae, and Michael created and edited this video that you are about to watch. And it's been really wonderful to work with them, especially as somebody who is an alum of the public history program myself. So I think they did a really great job, and we hope that you enjoy the documentary. So with that, we are gonna get started and we're gonna switch over and get the documentary up.
People want new things. They're tired of seeing blight. They're tired of seeing old things. I'm all for it. But we don't have to change the character of our neighborhood to incorporate new development with old. As a matter of fact, it's a beautiful thing when they both mesh together.
DC Preservation League got its start in the district in 1971 as Don't Tear It Down, created by activists who wanted to save the old post office on Pennsylvania Avenue. The activists were ultimately successful in saving the building through community effort and a passionate dedication to the cause. In 1984, Don't Tear It Down renamed their organization DC Preservation League, a name that has grown in prominence and use over the past 50 years. Today, DCPL is a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving and enhancing Washington's historic buildings and open spaces for future generations. Their legacy extends beyond buildings into the lives of individuals across the city.
First involved with DCPL when I heard honestly about this lady named Rebecca Miller.
So my name is Rebecca Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the DC Preservation League. I started here in April of 2003. I have a background in history and a master's in business administration. So, previous to the list for DC's most endangered list, the National Trust for Historic Preservation had started their list in the 1980s. And in 1996, during our 25th anniversary year, the Board of Trustees for the DC Preservation League decided that this would be a great opportunity to utilize the most endangered places list for Washington, D.C. to highlight different buildings or sites or neighborhoods that were struggling with either neglect, ill-advised alteration, demolition by neglect, or they were threatened with actual demolition.
The most endangered list signifies the critical condition of many locations that live on the edge of extinction. St. Elizabeth's East Agricultural Complex is a site that suffers from neglect and is under threat of demolition amidst ongoing development plans. Patients at St. Elizabeth's Mental Hospital ran a self-sufficient farm on this land, but today only 2 of the original buildings remain. In the urban environment of the city, this site is valued and unique as part of the district's agricultural history.
I found Metropolitan when I moved to Washington to work for the federal government, and the church was within walking distance to my little tiny apartment, and it just became my home from there. It's quite incredible, because when you think of a sanctuary, you do think of a place that is safe to go to, and Metropolitan is literally a sanctuary. It was one of the points that freed slaves would stop through as they were transitioning from the south to the north. And a lot of families and civil rights activists and social justice pioneers have either come through the church, spoken at the church, been funeralized at the church, made the church their home. That includes Frederick Douglass. Vernon Jordan was a longtime member. He just recently passed. Ernie Green is a member. Ernie Green of the Little Rock Nine is a member of our church. Gwen Eiffel was a faithful member forever, and we lost her a couple of years ago. And just the legacy of people who find their way to our church do so because I think it's a sanctuary that's sort of rooted in social justice. So preservation for us is an ongoing, everyday effort, because to your point and what I've shared, we are in the midst of development that really sort of takes over the neighborhood, and it's not a bad way. In a bad way, it's just the nature of the corporate world and living in an urban environment, and we are absolutely downtown in an urban environment. It's a passion work for those of us who attend the church.
The Alexander Cremel School graduated its last class in 1972 and stands as a testament to years of educational service. Named in honor of Alexander Cremel, noted African-American clergyman, activist, and educator, the building once operated as a center of neighborhood community. It has remained vacant since 1976. Designated as a DC landmark in 2003, neighborhood residents in Ivy City have been working with DCPL to advocate for the DC government to turn the school into an Ivy City community center. Built in the 1860s, Old Engine Company No. 6 is the oldest remaining example of a volunteer firehouse in DC. Its history reflects change in the district from volunteer forces unique to each neighborhood into the development of the professional firefighting force we know today. The building operated as a firehouse until 1974. Later in the 1990s, the building was threatened with demolition when a new development was being built around the building.
Firehouse number 6 was brought to us by one of our longtime volunteers, board members, committee members, who knew that this redevelopment was coming down the pike, and that we ought to take steps to preserve it. And clearly, you see the end result here, and also the building across the street, where there was success in preserving the particular historic resource. Anytime you can take a historic resource whose original use no longer fits that resource and find another use for it, that's a success.
This lonely half of a house in LaDroit Park was once the home of civil rights activist and suffragist Mary Church Tyrell. During the time that she and her husband lived here from 1899 to 1913, Mary Church Tyrell worked as the first African-American woman to serve on an American school board, and did so during a time when schools remained segregated. The Mary Church Tyrell House was listed on DCPL's Most Endangered list in 1999. and 19 years later, Howard University received a grant to restore the home for reuse.
My name is Sarah Vonish. I'm a historic preservation specialist with EHT Traceries, a local preservation consulting firm in DC. We just did the Howard University campus plan for 2020, which included a large preservation component, and that includes building surveys, research, and evaluation for their eligibility for listing in the DC Inventory or National Register of Historic Places. Mary Church Tyrell was such an important figure in civil rights and women's voting rights in the suffragist movement and education rights in DC. Such an important local figure that had such a large national impact. And the house was designated a National Historic Landmark back in 1974, and that really recognizes the national significance of Mary Church Tyrell and all the work that she did.
The De La Carlia Reservoir is one of the primary sources for drinking water in DC and has been utilized by the city since the 1850s. Workers once relied on the Superintendent's House as part of its system of operations, yet now the house stands vacant and neglected as a space that has been considered for demolition. The house is significant not only in the history of the reservoir, but in the larger history of big city water systems that expanded due to increased demand and increased population size.
Before were used as, from what I could remember, I think it was like many different things, like general store, maybe an ice cream parlor, different things. It was a fully functioning retail business corridor.
These properties on Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue are part of the Anacostia Commercial Corridor in the neighborhood's historic district. Owned and left vacant by the DC Housing and Community Development Agency, the buildings serve as an example of how lack of care can lead to demolition by neglect. While the removal of these turn-of-the-20th century buildings will eliminate some of the earliest commercial blocks of the district, DCPL partners like the Historic Anacostia Preservation Society have worked with developers to create new buildings that are compatible and complementary to the existing structures and the character of the Anacostia Historic District. Designed in 1904, the Washington Canoe Club has been a fixture on the Georgetown waterfront and an important center for Washington recreation for over a century. From an architectural standpoint, the Washington Canoe Club is among the best examples of the shingle style in the city, and the building's interior is decorated with a frieze by Felix Mahoney, cartoonist for the Washington Star and founder of the National Art School. The club represents the role of athletic clubs in 20th century recreational life and has produced numerous national champions and Olympic medalists. Despite upkeep over the years by loyal WCC members, the structure is deteriorating both internally and externally.
This building, you may have read, was designed by an architect in the early 20th century who had lived in Boston, was familiar with the vernacular there along the Charles River, wood-shingled kind of Victorian boathouses. And he brought that concept to Washington and designed this building, which was built in 3 phases over basically 20 years. That really connects us with that whole 19th century architectural history. I made a connection with Rebecca Miller, the executive director of the DC Preservation League, and obviously they were interested in this old building, and which was in terrible shape, and put it on their most endangered list for the city for a couple of years. I'm hoping, and this is the part that we're just starting to focus on, are there people who really care about historic preservation in greater Washington or across the country who will see this, as a very important building to save.
The Mount Zion Cemetery and adjacent Female Union Band Society Cemetery are 2 of the oldest remaining African American cemeteries in DC. The land was purchased in 1808 by the Dumbarton Street Methodist Episcopal Church. The African American members of this congregation broke off to form Mount Zion Church, which in 1879 took control of the cemetery. This was done with the help of the Female Union Band Society, a benevolent society of free African American women established in 1842. The cemetery stands as a physical representation of the society and culture African Americans in Georgetown created and the pride in this achievement. In 1976, the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation organized volunteers to clean up the neglected cemetery. Since then, the site has fallen back into disrepair.
Question. Oak Hill, look at Oak Hill. Look at this. This is as old as Oak Hill. Now, there's a reason for this. Why is this? And it's not different throughout the country. The white cemeteries have had support. The white community has had resources. They've had policies and regulations and all of that. The black cemetery and the black people have not had equal access to anything.
Well, here's what I hope. I hope that we will have an amphitheater. Not a large, not really large, but something whereby we bring, whenever we have seminars and demonstrations, and we can bring young people out here and teach them. I can't change the world, but I can change the little part of this environment that I reside in, and so that's what I do.
And what keeps me going, I think, is that I can't imagine that this community one day would not exist and be extinct.
Heritage in our past is important, and in a world that's changing very fast, it's good to be able to hang on to some, vestiges of the past and to have some grounding there.
It would be a shame to lose the characteristics of this community that was built by Americans over 100 years ago. And it tells the story of who was in Washington, where they lived, how they lived, what the craftsmanship was like, and it brings people from all over the world.
Thank you all for your hard work. So we're going to open it up for question and discussion. I will give, our documentary filmmakers a chance to introduce themselves.
I'll go first. I'm Shae Corey. I'm a first-year student at American University in the Public History program, and I'm primarily interested in community history, the history of slavery, and now DC history, since the experience is really great for me and combined a lot of my interests. So.
Sure, I'll go next. I'm Sajel. I am also a first year in the AU Public History program. I am primarily interested in community histories, as well as folklore studies, as that connects with history, and have already some experience with preservation through my current position at the DAR, and have really loved the opportunity to fully dive more into DC Preservation League and their work, and has been an absolute pleasure.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Jacobs. I'm also a first year at AU's Public History program. I'm very interested in American Jewish history as well as historic preservation. And throughout the course of this documentary, it really showed me how important historic preservation and public historians can be in creating community unity and trying to help preserve DC's history.
Great. And we are also joined by our Executive Director, Rebecca Miller. Is there other certain questions that maybe Shae, Sajel, or Michael need some help with about these projects?
And I'll just thank everybody for joining us tonight to see the students' work. I know that they spent the last semester doing this and coming through DCPL's archives and talking to a lot of people that have been involved in it. So we really appreciate the work that they've done on this.
Okay, so we do have one question from Jessica from Dress, who was our Community Outreach and Grants Manager. She's joining us tonight. She also worked with us on this. So thank you, Jess. She said, were there any common themes in your interviews?
I can touch on that. So I interviewed Dina Curtis and Greta Fuller. And so in those interviews, I think something that really struck me and was a common theme across both of those was just the passion that preservationists have and how much that motivates them and their love for their communities and for those specific buildings in their areas and their neighborhoods that really drives them. And so I think that it was really, really interesting and compelling to get the human perspective on preservation, because a lot of times it can be kind of relegated to just thinking about like buildings and there's like a lot of paperwork and different things that go into preservation. So getting the humanity behind it, I think was really impactful for me specifically. And I think that that theme extends into all of our interviews as well.
What do you guys think that you learned most from doing the interviews with the different panelists?
I'll go ahead and jump in and say, I think the thing that I maybe learned is that every location is different. So, you know, I think obviously there's some unifying factors in terms of, you know, what motivates people to save these locations and these spaces and what makes a location significant for a community. But I think the thing that I learned is, you know, the path to protecting these locations is unique every time. And that makes the work interesting and also challenging. And that also that, you know, the community is such a massive part of making, I think, so many of these a success stories that, you know, I think something that's really nice that I've noticed is DCPL, I think, has been really successful because they've, as an organization, been so great at like reaching out to different communities within DC, to different organizations within DC, and really like successfully creating long-lasting relationships that allow for the protection of these spaces. And I think that that's really fantastic. And it's like that's something I've really taken away.
Great. Yeah, and we have a question from Kelly. She asked, with so many endangered sites, how did the students choose to highlight these specific 9?
So we had some help from the DCPL. So they sent us in the beginning of our project a spreadsheet of the most endangered, and we kind of just picked ones that we were most interested in that aligned with our research interests, and also that I think Rebecca was interested in as well. And so it really worked out great because we were able to pick things that we either had experience in history-wise, or that we were just really interested in their location or the specific building.
Yeah, and when we were initially kind of choosing these sites too, we wanted to make sure we had kind of like a diverse group too in terms of like style, stories, right? So I think that was really important. I think we captured that pretty well too. Well, you guys captured that very well. So this is from a question from Judith. And Rebecca, this might be a question for you. So I guess in general, what is DCPL planning to do about the buildings on this list? Quite a few.
Judith, to be honest, harassing the owners is what we do best. Several of these properties have been on the most endangered list for decades at this point. And, unfortunately, DCPL is not in a position to just purchase properties and rehab them. Some other cities do that. They have their kind of their priority list and they rehab them. DCPL has really been focusing on specific buildings and making sure that they are a high priority for the ownership. Some of these that you saw have been a little bit more difficult to deal with. The agricultural complex at St. Elizabeth's, that is difficult in the sense that they have higher priorities with the other buildings on the East Campus to redevelop them for housing or mixed use development. And so the question of what the ag complex could be is still up in the air. At Del Carlia, the Superintendent's House, that's obviously a question of what's the adaptive reuse prospect for that. But we see a lot of hope in places like the Washington Canoe Club, where you have a really great partnership with the club, and also a lot of people who are pushing in that direction to really want to see the building back in service to the highest extent possible. So there's plans for each of these buildings and DCPL's advocacy goals. Some of them come from talking to the council. As was mentioned in the Cremel school site, we are working with our partners at Empower DC and also the Ivy City community to push for the adaptive reuse of that building as a community center and to make sure that the development that takes place around it is compatible with the landmark. So each one has a different plan associated with it.
I guess to kind of go off of that, we know some of these are not public access, but when it comes to so many of these sites, like, somebody asked, like, would public access be possible with some of these sites that we are like working to preserve? Like the Reservoir House is not publicly accessible, but could it be? I guess depending. This depends on like where we're at with it.
Yeah, it certainly could be whatever the reuse is. For instance, at the I keep going back to the ag complex at St. Elizabeth, the agricultural complex is, we could foresee some kind of use of it being used for a farmer's market or something like that, where people would have access to the 1903 stable and the 1887 dry barn that are original to the campus. So these are, there's great opportunities. To our knowledge, the dry barn is the last extant one in the city. So it's a great learning opportunity and a great educational tool if the city would put some resources towards it. And then there are also obviously some sites that are accessible. So Metropolitan AME is accessible, the Public House down on Mass Avenue, which used to be the firehouse, and also the Canoe Club. They have summer camps, well, not last year during COVID, but they started having summer camps and canoeing activities so that you could access that. And DCPL also has a crab feast every year at that site so that people can come and see the wonderful building and also get out on the water.
Great. Yeah, and then so Catherine asked, where is the reservoir that was referenced? So it's in like the Palisades, like the Superintendent's House. It's like in the Palisades neighborhood, I believe, right by like the Sibley Memorial Hospital. So kind of like in that area.
I can actually add to that a little bit. So it is actually adjacent to the hospital on a small gravel road that is accessible to the public. You can drive a vehicle right up there and walk around the premise. It is very much hidden, and it is definitely true, and it is off the beaten path, but it definitely is possible to see. You can see from the road as well. But yeah, it's just kind of hiding in a nice little shaded corner, as an example on my screen.
Yes. So Jess asked, did you learn anything that surprised you during the research process?
So this wasn't technically my location, and I'll let Sajel talk a little bit more about it, but I think we had a lot of fun. We actually got to go in person and interview Thornell Page, and that was a really, really great day because not only did we get to speak with him, but he also was making a lot of comparisons and drawing a lot of, making a lot of historical points about just in general the treatment of white cemeteries versus African-American cemeteries. And I think that that wasn't something that I had considered before or had to consider. And so I think that that was such an eye-opening experience for both of us in a lot of ways. And I think that it was just really, really cool to kind of get to see him and represent his story as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing for me that I wouldn't say anything surprised me per se, but I think what it does, and I think this is true every time you start to do research, is you realize, oh my gosh, how rich the research is and the history is of DC as a whole. I think so often DC history gets relegated to being understood as like political history, and it's like big men, like, you know, the sort of like presidents and Congress people. And I feel like so often like everything else gets kind of forgotten, but there's such a massively rich history available in this city that I think preservation does a wonderful job of really bringing to light for people who live here who maybe don't know about it. And I think for me, that's really, I think, not a surprise per se, but a really good reminder, and just really brought that to life for me personally.
And you, Michael, anything surprise you?
Yeah. I don't know if it would be a surprise. I think one thing that I guess inspired me was just how passionate these individuals in the communities were to their specific locations, and just the amount of work that all these people put in to protect these locations, and just the types of advocacy. Sorry, tongue-tied. It's just really inspiring to see that these grassroots efforts by ordinary people, and like to seeing change, like change can occur from the bottom up. And I think it's just really inspiring to see our future career paths, that this is absolutely something that is crucial, particularly to DC's history, and that I hope that we can help as well.
Great. So MJ wants to know, how did your interviewees get involved in preservation activity? Are there other ways that they collaborate with DCPL?
I can go ahead and start, at least for my interviewees, and say, again, I think this is really varied. So like for Edwin Fountain, who was in the past, I believe, a president of DCPL, he started actually when he was in law and did pro bono work. And so I know that's how he started sort of his path with DCPL. But I think there are lots of ways. I believe Dr. Thornell Page was already involved in some preservation efforts with other sites in DC, and then someone brought Mount Zion Cemetery to their attention. And then I think the relationship with DC Preservation League happened a little bit later down the road, and they were able to sort of offer some support and assistance in that manner. But I'll also let anyone else jump in who maybe has more info on sort of how their interviewees sort of got started with DCPL and with preservation more generally.
Sorry, Shae. So I guess particularly for Chris Brown, who is on the board of trustees for the Washington Canoe Club. Prior to being involved in the club, he was a federal worker before for the National Park Service. So he had a lot of, I guess, experience working with historic preservation and the Park Service, and he was able to bring that to the Canoe Club and his experience and help them really kind of with the process of the rehabilitation of the building. And then for my other two interviewees, which are Sarah Vonish of EHT Traceries and Peter Shefton, was also part of the DCPL Board of Trustees. Both of those individuals had a more traditional kind of career goal path, which was historic preservation, because they worked in those fields from the beginning, and both felt a connection to the work and wanted to use that to better their community, and particularly DC's community.
I'll just add on to that. If my memory serves me correctly, I believe that Greta has been doing a lot of different jobs and work with the DCPL, and specifically working with Rebecca. And I know that she was just so much fun to interview and talk about all of her expertise and different things that she's worked on. And then Dina, I know, is a member of Metropolitan AME, and I think that she's involved through that channel and working with the preservation of the church. So.
And just to follow up on their backgrounds, Greta's been involved through Historic Anacostia Preservation Society and Historic Anacostia Block Association, and joined our board a couple of years ago. She's been very involved. And Peter Sefton's been on the board for a long time and is the chair of our Landmarks Committee, which researches and documents all the landmark nominations that we submit to the Historic Preservation Office for consideration for listing in the DC inventory. Edwin was a past president of DCPL, and he is now, he was responsible for the World War I Memorial at Pershing Park, so he's still involved in that. And there also, Tyrell is a former board member of the Preservation League back in the, I believe in the late 80s or early 90s. So people who are involved in historic preservation tend to stick around for a long time and continue their efforts. And also part of the question was how to get more involved. And DCPL has a cadre of about 100 volunteers who work on research and documentation. They work on government affairs work, so any legislation that affects historic preservation in the District of Columbia. We also have a development committee that raises money. That's not really our most popular committee, as Kelly will tell you. And we also have education, which Melissa chairs, and with Juliet Zucker and Jason Young, who are on our board of trustees, who comes up with the educational programs and does programs like this for our membership and the public. So there's lots of opportunities. All we ask is that you're a member of the Preservation League, because we allow you all to make decisions on our behalf. And so we just look for people to be invested, and we're always looking for new talent to join. So please feel free anytime.
Yes, please. We love new volunteers. Especially it's our 50th anniversary, which I'll talk about later. So definitely join us now. So we have some questions from Facebook. This one says Oak Hill, but I think it's about Mount Zion actually. But it's what is the follow-up to clean up the cemetery as needed and encourage visitation and education? I guess did Thornell really talk about more about this outreach, how folks can kind of get more involved with the site?
So what I can do is I think I need to find it, but I know that there's still continuing volunteer efforts actively right now. I'll have to go find the link and see if I can include it on the post and on Facebook, but they are actively continuing to care for the space based on volunteer work, and that's happening now. You can sign up now, so that's still an option. I know Dr. Page and others are still working with DCPL to try and advocate for that space as much as possible as well. And I think ultimately my understanding is the goal is obviously to do right by the history of the location and the respect to the individuals who are buried there, and then also to use the space as much as possible as a learning center. Basically is a sort of open air amphitheater type style place where people can gather and learn, and that's, I believe, what they're hoping to do in the future.
Yeah, and we will definitely we can include a link to more information about that on Facebook.
It's accessible to the public, so it's open, and you could go and see the site for yourselves. And DCPL prepared a preservation plan with the help of traceries for the Mount Zion Female Union Band Cemetery trustees back in 2016. And so the goals have been to implement that plan over time as they're applying for grants and whatnot. I know that they are doing a lot of research and genealogy with regards to the site, so that they can talk to any ancestors that who have family relations that are buried there. So there's a lot of great programs that are taking place in education going forward.
So another question from Facebook, from Karen. Is the Howard renovated home accessible to the public? I believe this is about the Tyrell house, sorry, well, mine. Do they offer events or other opportunities to bring attention to it? I know it's not currently accessible to the public. I don't know what exactly are Howard's specific plans. Rebecca, have we heard of anything from them, or is it kind of still in the early planning phase, I guess?
The plan is for a community gathering space. Has received funds from several National Park Service funds, grant funds from African American Action Funds and things like that from the National Trust as well. And so my understanding from traceries, because this is part of our advocacy work, is constantly asking when things are going to start, is that I'm told that there's implementation going to be starting very soon.
Great. Yeah, and also in the chat, you guys all might notice we are currently accepting nominations to the Most Endangered Places list. So a link is there in the chat, and if you have a site that you would like to nominate, please do so. That is the first step, right? So please let us know. And also, we put in the chat that the next Landmarks Committee meeting is on May 5th. So if you're interested in possibly attending, just to see, what the Landmarks Committee is like. They're the ones who are like doing this work, putting the nominations together for, that takes to HPRB that gets these sites nominated. So if you're interested in that, please email us, let us know. See if we have any other questions. Okay, Michael, we have a couple questions for you when it comes to the Superintendent's House. If you're able to, can you give just a slightly more detailed explanation of how you got there, I guess, if you can?
Sure. So on the DCPL's website, there is an address for the Superintendent's House. If you go to Google Maps and you just kind of go to the left of the address, you will find the house hidden on Google Maps on that street. So if you just drive up that street, you will see it will either be on your left if you're coming into the hospital, and on your right if you're driving through the hospital. I can get the exact geo coordinates if that would help people if they would like to go see it. But yeah, it is definitely not the easiest location to find. That's definitely for sure, but it is accessible for those who want to explore a little bit.
Yeah, and we can definitely probably put more information onto on our Facebook post where we're streaming right now, just more information. And Michael, I don't know if you know this in your research, but Linda asks, and I'm gonna mispronounce his name, and I know that. Is it
Montgomery Miggs?
Yeah, thank you.
Miggs.
Montgomery Miggs. Okay. Is it known that the Superintendent's House is a Montgomery Miggs design?
Michael, go ahead, but if you aren't sure, I'm happy to jump in too.
Please, Sajel, if you have a direct.
I can say, yeah, as my understanding is yes, from the nomination forms that was confirmed that is who was the architect for that house, as far as I understand it.
You are correct. It is Montgomery Miggs, who was also the architect for the pension building, now known as the National Building Museum, among other buildings around town.
Okay. Yes, Monica, thank you so much for your question. Monica asks, how can we donate? So I will put a link into the chat now for a donation page. This is specifically for our 50th anniversary donation page. I just have it on hand, but I will get the general one too in a moment. But yes, we greatly appreciate any sort of, financial support. It really helps us in doing this work, and really, couldn't do it without it, so if you are able to, we would really, definitely appreciate your consideration for donating to us. And again, you could always volunteer as well. It doesn't have to just be monetary support. There's a lot of footwork that needs to be done as well. So 1 second, I'll get the other, while we wait for questions. Any other questions?
I have a question for all of our panelists, if there's no other from the gallery.
I don't think so.
I would like to know, so from your experience, so this was one of the reasons that DCPL became involved with the public history program was that we were finding that there wasn't a whole lot of collaboration amongst historic preservation and public history. And we thought that this would be a great opportunity to kind of expand how we were telling the story. I'm very technically inclined to tell stories about buildings, so I talk about the architectural character of them, but the stories behind them, it seems to be what grasps people and the experience of those who are trying to save these buildings. So from your perspective as public history students, how do you feel that public history has a role in saving historic buildings in the future? Do you want to start, Shae?
Sure. So I think that's such a good question, and I feel that public history is such a broad field, and there are so many different ways that historic preservation is kind of intertwined into the fabric of public history in a lot of ways, especially considering like community history programs, and especially like thinking about DCPL's volunteer base and the different ways that that is like a common factor in a lot of community organizations as well, which is what like I've personally had experience with and been involved with. I feel like public history, in my experience, is very story driven, like what you're talking about. And I feel like that's what engages people a lot of times, is this sense of shared humanity, or the idea that we can kind of connect to people in the past, even if they had a very different lived experience than we did. And I feel like buildings are really underestimated, and thinking about the ways that historic preservation kind of shapes our built environment. And I know that I feel kind of the same way about geography that I do about historic preservation. Like people don't think about geography like in just like spatial placement of cities, which is kind of, I'm getting off topic, but I think that it's really important when we're thinking about the different ways that our city is set up, and especially when we're thinking about local history. I think that like historic preservation is so essential to telling like the public facing history of DC. And so I think that they're really intimately connected, and that they are mutually beneficial to each other. So I was just really excited to kind of put all of our public history work into practice, and do that through telling the human stories of historic preservation, because I think that it was just great and a really great way to kind of put those things together.
I'll jump in after you, Shae. And sorry, Michael, I just jumped the train on you. But I think number one, I think you're right, Rebecca, to point out that sometimes it does feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect. And I think that in part comes from, number one, just a huge focus on sort of where people think that they interact with history. So museums, exhibits, that type of thing, I think is like where our minds instinctually go when we think about public history. And of course, that's a massive part of public history. But there are a lot of different places, as Shae pointed out, that people go to connect with history. Historic sites, historic homes, et cetera, are all a huge part of that. And I think those are available to us because of preservation. And I think that's just like that missing link that sometimes isn't always like at the forefront of how people understand sort of why these sites are around and are able to be like museums now, or that kind of thing. And so I think that's really important, that we have the opportunity to work with DCPL and vice versa, so that can be part of our education as well, and how we understand public history. I think is really valuable. And I think to Shae's point, it's so important, and public historians talk about this all the time, to have a way for people to connect with stories and with history. And the tangible, is really a valuable tool for us as public historians to teach people. And we talk about that a lot with material culture, and that goes into exhibit making, but also physical space that you can walk into is such a massive part of that. And it can be really, really powerful. And I think that is such a huge part of what I think public historians are starting to sort of delve into as well, is how can we sort of use these physical spaces to tell these stories. And I think that that's really important. And that was part of what we really enjoyed about doing this project, was getting to particularly bring stories to life, especially of the activists, not just the history of the spaces, but also the history of the people who work hard to protect them.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Sajel and Shae have said. I think through the process of creating this documentary, we really got practice working in the field and working with like the community and the public and really putting like our experiences into practice. And I feel like as public historians, we're able to kind of bridge the gap between like the public facing and the community and with the scholarship and like academia, and we're able to bring information we learned from academia through like doing research and kind of present it to the public and be able to like tell them these amazing stories of these spaces and kind of like almost help breathe the life into these unique experiences that we see throughout history and that are connected to either these locations and to these activists. And we're kind of I feel like bring history to life. And that may sound a little corny, but I think as creating this documentary, we're able to really reflect such a diverse community in DC, and through historic preservation, really kind of create this like lens of perspective that makes history feel alive and makes it feel like part of the reality by looking at these buildings. You don't just see brick and mortar, you see these stories and you see these like individuals, and really it creates a much more rich atmosphere that everyone I feel like can contribute to, and it's definitely a positive.
And I'll just add just really quickly, so the reason why I went into the public history program too is, in undergrad, like I was in like the more academic history kind of field, but then there was something so special and like personal about public history that I didn't really so much see in like academic paper writing that was kind of more common in like the more academic history setting, but then kind of coming down to Washington DC and like being able to kind of work in a museum space first, you kind of see the way that people really personally connect with, like the tangible, like you all are saying, like at the American History Museum here in DC, there's this one exhibit that's just a house, right? And it's been there for like years and years and years, and people still love it because it is the structure where all of these like memories happened, right? Like all of these different points in history. And then that's kind of what really set me off into like falling in love with preservation as well. It's like these kind of place-based stories and memories that are housed in these like structures that aren't just like it's not like just bricks and mortar, right? They are like actual places that do have life, and especially like in preservation work, like the most endangered places list, and you're able to kind of like get these places preserved and enhance them and kind of get them back to, what they were, but then also serves the public today. I think it's like really, really wonderful thing that can happen. That's just my 2 cents, but I again, ditto to what everybody else has said here. I don't know, there's no other questions from our audience. I don't know, Rebecca, did you have any other questions, or was there anything that you all wanted to talk about that maybe we didn't have any questions about, as you were creating the documentary?
I don't have any other questions. I'd just like to thank the students for doing all this work. It's been great to work with you, and I think you have a great product. Thank you.
Yes, I completely agree. Yeah, it was really wonderful to work with you all these past few months. You did an amazing job. I think you really like captured these stories really wonderfully, and it was just also just great to hear like your interviews with these community advocates and leaders. So it was really wonderful. So I'm just gonna put a couple of links into the chat before we end things here. Okay. Okay, so just in the chat, I put our website and then also our DC Historic Sites app. If you don't know what the app is, it's free. There's also an associated website with it, but it's geolocated, so you can kind of explore the historic sites around you while you use it. We also have like thematic tours on there as well that you can check out to learn about these places and more. Also our contact information and our social media handle. So as well as our just recently launched 50th anniversary webpage, where you can kind of learn more about our celebrations this year. So just before we close out, I just want to remind everybody to just keep a lookout for other upcoming DCPL events. This year we are celebrating our 50th anniversary, and as part of that, we launched this new website that you can kind of learn more about what our celebration is going to look like. But then also we're having a year-long celebration full of like robust programming, and each month we're going to highlight a different theme. So this month was Most Endangered Places. And next month, we are highlighting historic parks and gardens throughout the city. Please take a moment, look at that webpage. The other themes are listed there as well, as well as some other information. And please be on the lookout for our next events blast email each month. At the beginning of each month, we send out just like an announcement of all the upcoming programs that we have. And in May, we have a really great lineup, and we hope that you will take a look at that. If you're not already signed up for like our newsletter and stuff, you can sign up for that on our website and see what we have planned. And I just want to thank Sajel, Shae, and Michael again for all of your hard work to produce this for us. It was really wonderful. Again, it was really great to work with you. And a big thank you to our interviewees for their participation in this documentary and for their work to preserve Washington, D.C.'s built environment and all these very special places. And thank you all for joining us for tonight, and we hope that you join us for future DCPL programs. Again, if you have any questions following this program, you can email us at info@dcpreservation.org. Again, and thank you, Rebecca, as well for joining us. So with that, yes, thank you.
Thank you all.